Be here that Sunday. After I'm done, Dion's going to take over the class for a while. So, all right, let's get into it. Chapter 27. So, we're still in Caesarea. Paul's being held here for 2 years. As a matter of fact, he's being held in the Praetorium there. He came here in chapter 23, at the end of 23. And so he was here through 24, through 25, through 26, and he's still there right now. So, the end of 26, so having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place. So if you notice, he gave us a defense to Felix, to Festus, to Agrippa. And he's talking about that. And if we go all the way back to chapter 9, on the road to Damascus, when he was being led into, I forgot where he was being led into, Damascus. God said, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings, and the sons of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake." So we've seen this prophecy come to fruition in Paul's life. He's talked to leaders, to kings, and he's going to go talk to Caesar next. So this was all planned out for Paul way ahead of time, as God's plan often is. So that brings us to chapter 27, Paul's voyage to Italy. When it was decided that we, and who's the we here? Maybe
Luke.
It's got to be at least Luke. When Luke says we, it includes him. It also, we'll see it in next verse that includes Aristarchus, yes. So at least 3 of them that are mentioned. So when it was decided that we would sail to Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Adamanthian ship, which was about to sail to the region along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. And I put some verses to show you how often he's mentioned by Luke and Paul as a companion of Paul. So, you might want to know, where is Adramyttium? You can see up in the map there, it's up in the left corner, top area of Asia. And so the ship that they were going to go on was going all the way up there. Now we can see from the map, because somebody wrote all over it, they're not going to make it all the way up there. They're going to stop at Myra, but we'll get there. So at this part of the journey, they're put aboard a ship. And it could either be one of these coastal ships like this, but since it's going so far, I think it probably is a little bit bigger ship than the one Paul was used to using going up and down the coast. And we're going to look at more ships, because we have, this is the ship chapter. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. Normally, you see a city, I go into a big explanation of the city, but Tyre and Sidon are very similar. Sidon's a couple hundred years older. Tyre was a daughter sister of it. They're almost always mentioned together in the Bible. Jesus mentions to a couple of cities in Judea, if the things that you have seen had been seen by Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented. They'd be sitting in ash and sackcloth and ash, and you guys don't. So the fact that these notoriously idolatry and kind of a vicious cities Jesus said would have responded better than my own people. So I didn't go into it because there's not much difference between the two cities. So, and we talked about this last week also, that Paul's receiving care again. So he's up there in years. He's got some kind of physical ailment. We don't know for sure, but he's kind of up. So you can see that they make just that small hop. And our first question was, who was Julius?
Paul's personal guard.
Well, yeah, not guard as in protecting him, but guard as in he's a prisoner.
Yeah.
Responsible for him, yeah. He's a centurion, so that means he commands 100 men. He's of the Augustus cohort. A cohort is about 600 soldiers, and if it bears a name of one of the emperors, it's an honor to them. So this is an important cohort that he's with. And they probably actually protected the emperor at one time or another to earn that title of the Augustan cohort. So how did he treat Paul?
With respect.
Respect and kindness.
With consideration. Let
Yeah.
him go and be helped by his friends.
Did he need to do that?
No?
I wouldn't even expect them to do that. So Paul has probably, go ahead.
He must have gotten close to Paul and to know him, being with him so much. And
Yeah.
having to be responsible for him. And Paul probably has been teaching him and talking and explaining. And he's seeing Paul's a good guy. You know,
Trustworthiness.
He's trustworthy, he's honest, he's not. So
Yeah.
he probably has developed a rapport and respect.
He's in their palace, the Praetorium, and he's there for 2 years, so there is a good chance that he knows this man, and I would suspect that. Brad?
I was going to say, Julius seems as though he was a man who knew good character.
Yeah. And we're going to see that throughout this chapter. A couple times he does things at Paul's request. One time he didn't, and that led to disaster, but we'll get there. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. So you can see now, majority of maps had the line going up above Cyprus because the winds are coming this way. That would be the shelter. A few, for some reason, put it under Cyprus because they sailed under the protection, so I think they misquoted. And we'll see when we get to it, the sea currents and stuff, and it actually mentions they sailed along the coast of Cilicia. So they went up, and the line probably went much closer to the shore, and they eventually ended up over here in Myra. So at that point, they're going to hop ships. So here's what I was talking about. Let's see if I can get my pointer. There we go. So you can see Alexandria is here. That's going to be important in the next ship that they take. But they took off from here, and they're following these currents up the coast, and you can see the currents go close, and they go close, and here's about where Myra is. So they're late in the season of taking off, and of course we're going to see how it causes consequences. So they're probably using the currents at this time. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy and put us aboard it. Now, an Alexandria ship means it's coming from where I showed you, along the coast of Egypt, which means it's a grain ship, and later they throw the grain out, so we know that's true. Those ships are much bigger. A grain ship is delivering the food to Rome. They're the Nile Valley is the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. So it's going to be a much bigger ship. This doesn't quite show you the scale, even though it's supposed to be a replica of what they kind of look like. It could have also been one that was supported by rowing too, which might explain why there were 278 people on the boat. So they also might have been fitted out with oars. Now, even this doesn't show you how big it is, so I'm going to show you a picture here. This is a Roman era ship built, I believe, by Nero. This one is 230 feet big. Now, the big Alexandrian grain ones were probably 180, so it's about 20% smaller. But if you look down there at the front, that's a person standing down there at the front. So it gives you an idea how big this ship is. You know, okay, let me read you here. Alexandrian grain ships, known for their large capacity and robust construction, were pivotal to maintaining the grain supply to Rome. These ships could carry upward of 1,300 tons of grain and measure up to 180 feet in length, indicating their significance not just for the trade, but also for the transportation of people, as illustrated in Acts, which recounts 276 individuals, I said 78 a second ago, aboard Paul's voyage. So it's a much bigger ship than Paul's probably been on in his little back and forth journeys. This one was built by Nero. It was actually built on a lake, two of them, one 230 feet, one 240 feet, made into big palaces with marble and everything. So it's just slightly bigger than a grain ship, but they don't have any good examples like this of the actual grain ships. Being wood, they mostly disintegrated in the ocean. The fact that this one was found in the lake in the mud and then covered up, it was preserved. So, when we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Sindus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. So, another map. So, you can see, bring my pointer up again. You can see they were at my, oh, it disappeared. Hang on, let me get my pointer. There we go. So they were at Myra, they changed ships, they sailed through this way, and you can see the big blue arrows are the direction that the normal winds are blowing. So that ship wanted to go up here, the other ship wanted to go up there. The Alexandrian ship wants to get over to Italy. But with the contrary winds and the contrary currents, they had to veer this way and come down under here where they pass Salome. And they're going to end up down here in a port called Fairhaven by Lycia. So I think my next picture is the currents again. You can see how the currents are opposite the way they wanted to go. The winds were opposite the way they wanted to go. And with difficulty, so they're fighting this time, and that's why maybe it was one of the ships with oars, I'm not sure. But they're making slow headway at a time when they should have probably already stopped. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fairhaven, near which was the city of Lycia. Now, Fairhaven is a city much like the naming of Greenland and Iceland. Greenland is all covered with ice, Iceland's all covered with lush trees to fool people. Fairhaven is a port that's not a good haven. So they're not able to stop there. So what they want to do is get a little farther on. This is a little bit closer up picture of where they're at under Crete there, Fairhaven. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, Since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them. And he said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." What was Paul's assessment of the sailing conditions as described in verse 10? And how did Paul, not a sailor, know this? Brad?
Well, God had something to do with that.
Probably. We know later on he definitely does. He doesn't stop them from leaving, though. He warns these people, but they don't listen to him this time. Now, was it God's will that they went this way and wrecked anyways, or not? Eddie?
Well, we know the three infamous missionary journeys of Paul. Is this one of them?
Well, yes and no. He's not voluntarily going, he is going. He's going to do a lot of missionary work in Rome. His job was to present God's plan to the emperor.
But this is in addition to the three missionary journey he had, right?
Yeah, the three that we know of. There is considerable thought that he may have gone on some other little ones that aren't listed, but the three we know of.
So having three under his belt, don't you think he has some knowledge about sailing and traveling?
He has a layman's knowledge, yes. But we'll see at the point where he says, "Don't let these sailors get off the boat, we'll die," that he's not an expert, but he does know that it's time of the year that they don't normally sail.
Because journey taken back then is not 7-day cruise or 21-day cruise. These are all year-long cruise for Paul, at least a year.
Weeks long, at least. Yeah, weeks long.
But he would have some knowledge of sailing from experience,
That's what I do with some,
But-
yeah.
but he says some things that are very specific there that seem to go beyond the knowledge of a sailor. And then the very next verse, when it talks about him believing the sailor more than Paul,
Mhm.
this is not just sailors' knowledge. So they know what a difficult travel would be, but to say, look, not only are we going to have damage to our cargo, we're going to have loss of life going this way.
The ship, the cargo, our lives.
Yeah.
And I think Paul was trying to convince the centurion, don't go on with if the ship goes on. I don't think he was trying to talk the ship out of going. I think he was trying to talk the centurion
Right.
out of, hey, don't go, wait,
But there's clearly was contention between him and what a more experienced sailor would know. So
yeah.
again, it goes back to the question of how did Paul know this? Would it just be experience? Or you have someone who that's what they do in their livelihood. So it seems his knowledge goes beyond just experience.
I agree. I think he's warned, but the warning doesn't come true. They don't lose their lives. So was it changed because he prayed? Was that not exactly God's plan? So we don't know. All we can do is speculate. But I do think that he probably had some kind of knowledge through the Holy Spirit that, listen, it's getting dangerous. Or Paul's just an overly cautious person. So, did they listen to Paul? Should they have listened to Paul? But then we wouldn't have Acts 27, which is a great story. So it mentions it's already past the fast. So the fast is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. It's in late September in 59 AD, around there. It would have been October 5th, The dangerous season in the Mediterranean in this area is from September to November. After that, all navigation on the sea ends until winter's over. So there is an area that's considered dangerous, but they still might try it if they have favorable conditions. He's right smack dab in the middle of that dangerous area. After November, they stop for several months until the next year, until springtime. The Mediterranean is very inhospitable, especially to the technology they had back then. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said to Paul, by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, so a place called Fair Haven is not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. And that's what I think is the key there. The captain and the pilot and the owner of the ship didn't want their ship to be destroyed in harbor, so they were going to try to get to a safe place. The centurion should have listened to Paul and not gone with them, but he did. So they reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there, which was not very far away. We'll see a map here in a second. When a moderate south wind came up, so remember, most of the winds right now are blowing from the west to the east, so it's hard for them to go this direction towards the north, but a south wind comes up. So they thought, hey, we got a chance. Supposing they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. So, you can see Phoenix is not very far away. You'd think you could just hug the coast, be very careful and get to Phoenix, and then they would have spent the winter there. But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euroquale. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, they gave way to it and let themselves be driven along. So this time of the year, they're probably trying to tack and face into the wind. And this wind is so violent, all they could do is turn and let it push them. So what is this wind? It's a compound of the Greek word euros, meaning east wind, and Latin aquilo, northeast wind. Hence, it's an east-northeast wind. So, instead of coming this way from the north west area, all of a sudden the wind's coming from the perpendicular, and it's blowing them straight away from Crete. This agrees with the experience of navigators in those waters, so they still face this sometimes.
Matt,
Yes.
I was reading a book on Captain Cook, the Modern Navigation, and you know, you put the little chart up with the wind factor.
Yeah.
I really believe he studied those factors. I've seen his diagrams, they're very similar. And
All sailors did.
And they track not just the wind factor, but the rock factor also.
Yeah.
Because you might get shipwrecked, you know, and they use like Saxon's instruments. They don't have it back then until Cook came along. But it's not just a star that.
No, they had charts, and as a matter of fact, those records, like Captain Cook would have kept, anybody else, they kept the ships keep records, and throughout history, this is how they can go back and tell somewhat what the weather was like in different times by looking at what these captains wrote down. They would write down temperatures and things like that, and it's pretty much our only record is ship's captain's logs for
That
many
log is very
years.
important because he's the one that discovered Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, I don't think those are in the Mediterranean though. So, running under the shelter of a small island called Claudia, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. Does anybody know what a ship's boat is? So when you have a big ship, you can't go to shore real easy and get supplies and ferry people back and forth. So you have a little boat that's called the ship's boat. And normally, it's towed behind the ship. now they're being driven by the wind. What's the wind going to do to that little boat that's tied up and normally following behind them? It's banging all over the place and can cause havoc. So that's the sailing ship Tally Ho, by the way. You can watch that being rebuilt for 7 years. It was a great series. So they're off Crete, and the wind's coming now this way, and they're blown down. Now, I did a lot of research on why this line, even though they're being blown this way, and it actually says that they were afraid of being running aground in the Syrtis Major, yet it talks about them being in the Adriatic Sea, and it has something to do with the number of days, and they were able to reach Crete. And so they had to have been blown back fairly back and forth for them to reach Crete in those number of days. So, of course, they don't know the exact course. Matter of fact, there's arguments about what island they landed on. Melita is what we now call Malta, but there are actually 3 islands. One of them's up in the Adriatic. And so there are a lot of people who have different theories about where they landed. And we're going to look at Malta, of where he landed on that. Several times I was sure we found the right place, and then the next article would tear that one apart. And so after they had hoisted it up, we're talking about the ship's boat, they pulled it up onto the deck. They used supporting cables in undergirding the ship. What this means is, in very rough weather, they would take these big rope cables and they would wrap them around the ship and tighten them so that the huge pounding that the ocean was giving them wouldn't break the boat apart. So it was a backup strategy. And fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. So the shallows of Sirte are 2 areas off North Africa there where it was on that map. We'll go back. And these are notorious, let me see, in the context of seafaring, undergirding a ship, okay, we did that. Here it is. The Sirte Major. Strabos, who was a historian around, I think around 200 AD, the difficulty with both the greater Sirte and the lesser is that in many places their deep water contains shallows. And the result is, at the ebb and the flow of the tides, that sailors sometimes fall into the shallows and stick there, and that the safe escape of a boat is rare. On that account, sailors kept at a distance when voyaging along the coast, taking precautions not to be caught off their guard and driven by wind into these gulfs. So these 2 gulfs, basically they have all these sandbars. So think of the sand dunes on the land. They had underwater sandbars that moved around, and it was like a maze in there, and ships would get in there and not be able to get out. So that's why the sailors didn't want to be driven. The wind was driving them right towards that area. So they let down a sea anchor. Does anybody know what a sea anchor is? Okay. Obviously, they're in the middle of the Mediterranean. They can't let down an anchor to touch the ground. So they let down what's called a sea anchor. Here's a modern version of it. And what it is it's just something you tow behind the boat. And because it's in the water, catching the water, it applies tension at the back of the boat, holding them. They're being driven this way. Now the problem is they're being driven by wind. If a wave comes up, it could turn them sideways, and the next wave could swamp them. So by putting this sea anchor on the back, it keeps them pointing one direction, so they can't be swamped by rogue waves out there in the ocean. They can't be tipped over and capsized. As a matter of fact, I didn't put it in here, but Josephus was on a boat that was caught in this wind, and their boat capsized, and of like nearly 300 people, only about 80 lived. So that wind, that random wind that would come out of there was a dangerous thing. So it's interesting that Josephus himself. Here's some other pictures of both could be used as a sea anchor, or these were actually ancient anchors before they started making. You see the 3 holes? The first hole was where a rope would grow through. The other 2 holes would look like a toothpick. Think of a toothpick. It was a big stick that was pointed on either end, and those would hit the ground, flop, and they would be their version of old anchors. But they also would work as a sea anchor, dragging behind, just causing that drag on the boat. The next day, as they were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. You got to be pretty desperate when you start throwing the cargo over, and then parts of the ship. So the tackle would be extra rigging. It would be those poles that they could use to load and unload cargo. So they're getting rid of anything they can to lighten the boat, because they're probably taking on water and bailing all this time. So why did the crew throw the cargo overboard? Lighten the load. They wanted to live. They're stuck in a violent storm. This is only day 3. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on all hope of being saved was gradually abandoned. So here they are. We're going to read here in a while that they weren't eating. They're tossed for 14 days in this storm that doesn't seem to end. They gave up. They were giving up. They didn't think they were going to make it. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice." I love that. I told you so. And not to have set sail from Crete and incur this damage and loss. Yet, now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Now, how could Paul have known this?
Inspiration.
Huh?
Inspiration or revelation.
Yeah, how? Because I don't care how much a seasoned sailor is, Paul couldn't have known this without word from God. So at some point God says, well, Paul's protected by plot armor. Paul can't die until he does God's mission. So Paul's not going to die. And I can only imagine that Paul asked for the lives of everybody else on board, because he says nobody's going to die. And in a shipwreck like we're going to see, that is very unusual. Like I said, the one with Josephus, out of 300, only 80 made it out. So,
As a good leader, he would have said this also. As a good leader.
yeah. Oh, you're saying he's just
Yeah, keep everybody's spirit up.
keep everybody's spirit up.
And give everybody hope.
Yeah, but I think Paul knew more than that. For this very night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, "Do not be afraid, Paul." There again, do not be afraid. "You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you." So, although a good leader would say this, Paul knew it. Paul has total trust in the Lord. He knows it. "Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as it has been told. But we must run aground on a certain island." So, obviously, he knew more than he quoted to the men there. He knew that there was a certain place that he had to run aground. So, what encouraging words did Paul bring to the crew and passengers of the ship? I know these questions just seem too easy, don't they?
You won't die.
When I do the next series, I'll be making the questions, not using them from a prior lesson. So the questions will be a little bit more relevant. Yeah, I mean, like Eddie was saying, encouraging words. He told them, listen, ship might be gone, but you're all going to live. And at that point, they probably had a hard time believing it, but if it was true, they would be happy. So, this question, where is the Adriatic Sea? So I expect you all to know the Mediterranean map perfectly by now. So,
Northern coast of Africa?
the Sea of Adria. So it's up there, and it says that they were in that, yet the ship line is below it, and they thought they were even lower. So that confounds a lot of people when they try to recreate. They say, with all the information that Luke gave us, we should be able to tell exactly what happened. But when the 14th night came, 14 nights of storm, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. I was surprised to learn how they surmised this. Because the next verse says, they took soundings and found it 20 fathoms. But they began to surmise it beforehand. And the first 2 times I taught this, I didn't know how they did. What they would do in these kind of situations, so they had a person, you see in the old stories of somebody up in the crow's nest. They probably didn't have crow's nests. They had somebody on watch, listening for waves breaking on rocks. Because it's loud and booming and carries over the flat ocean. So they're listening for that to know when they get near land. So they start hearing that. So then they start dropping the sounding, which is just a long rope with a rock on the end. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little further on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Does anybody know what that is? A fathom's about 6 feet. So the first time they were 120 foot of water, second time 90 foot of water. So they're approaching land at a shallow slope, but they're getting close. Fear that they might run aground somewhere on the rocks, so they knew there were going to be rocks. They cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. They can't do very much in the nighttime on a dark ocean. They wouldn't even know which way to swim or whatever. So they dropped 4 anchors. And we'll talk about these type anchors, but that's a pretty good depiction of what an Alexandrian ship, Roman era anchor would have looked like. So they know that they're in shallow enough water they can drop these anchors and arrest their movement and not crash into the rocks. So now I wanted to talk about the rabbit hole I went down. St. Paul's Bay is the traditional site of where people on Malta say he shipwrecked. The only problem is it doesn't fit the description. The little next bay over fits the description. It has a sandbar right in the middle, a little reef. It has sandy beaches, and they found Roman anchors in the ocean. And I thought, wow, we found the place. You can see the direction of the wind up there. I said, we found it. This is where he really shipwrecked. Then there's another account of St. Thomas Bay that's down here, and it has the exact same thing. The right setup, beach, sandbar. They found 4 Roman anchors within a 40-yard circle at 120 foot depth, 2 more anchors at 90 foot depth, which would have been the front anchors. So I thought, oh, that's it. And then somebody else tears that theory apart, saying, part of the problem is when they got close, the sailors didn't know the land. And this, along this eastern and northern side of the island, was a major thoroughfare there for sailors. They should have known all the coastline there. So it complicates things. You can't be for sure where the shipwreck happened. So, that shows the direction of the wind. It shows where the ship was going. And the reason I brought this up is, see the other place up there called Melita in the Adriatic Sea? And they actually have the Adriatic Sea and the Iona Sea and the Mediterranean. So they say the shipwreck happened way up there. Only that doesn't make really good sense, because they would just go across it to Rome after things were better. Yet they come back all the way down and go from Malta to Syracuse and then up the coast of Rome. So I believe Malta is the right island. I don't think we can ever say for sure which bay they ended up in, but they did. So this is one of the anchors that they brought up from one of those sites. It's not really the anchor. This is the collar. It's the top part that goes to the top of an anchor. It's made out of lead. It's the only part that survives. The rest was made out of wood. They believed, so many people believed, that this was the right anchor, that the Vatican got involved, and they say this is the only artifact we have from New Testament times. I blocked out somebody who wears a robe and and people kiss his ring and stuff. But they think that that's the correct anchor. Again, I say it's probably one of those two places, and it could be another that we don't know of. So this is what an anchor looked like. That top part is the part made of lead. And the rest was made of wood, and it would have a collar down here holding it together and metal tips on the barbs. Here's a replica of what one looks like. And the reason is that lead, when the anchor comes down, that lead makes it tip over, and the arms going out make sure it tips over so that the point is sticking in the ground. So when you pull on that rope, it causes that point to stick into the bottom of the ocean, the sand and mud. So lots of these collars are left, but that wood is all deteriorated. Wood doesn't do well in salt water. Too many things want to eat it. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. So they let those 4 anchors out. And remember that boat that they had a hard time getting up on the ship? They let the boat down, and we're going to go out and say, well, we're just going to put 2 more anchors at the front of the boat to help, keep the boat. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes from the ship's boat and let it fall away. What were some of the sailors trying to do? They were trying to abandon the ship. They were getting in that rowboat, knowing that they had probably a better chance if they abandoned the big ship and all the other people that are there and try to get away. Why did the soldiers cut the rope away? Paul's warning. You let these guys out of here, they're the ones who know how, when it comes daybreak, how to run this ship. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, now having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 676 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. So now there's 180, or up to 120 or 130 tons of wheat. They start throwing that out, lightening it, knowing that they're going to have to beach the ship. When the day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship into it if they could. And casting off the anchors, They let them in the sea while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. So they dropped those anchors there. That's why they found them years later. And hoisting the foresail, that's the little sail that's at the front, they were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to break up by the force of the waves. So the front of the ship sticks in a sandbar or a reef. The back is being pushed back and forth and starts to break apart. Now the thing where two seas meet, and I thought, what does that mean? Was that currents, whatever? And they said that they experienced this off of Malta, in both of those bays, when the water comes in and then recedes a little bit, the water comes back up, and when it hits that sandbar, it comes up, and when it comes back from this side, it hits the sandbar, and you get this big crashing wave, and that's what's tearing the ship apart. And that's why they call it two seas meeting, was the water from both directions hitting the sandbar. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. Remember that in Rome, you cannot let your prisoner escape, you take his place. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intentions and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that all were brought safely to land. So how many lost their lives? No one. So I know I went a few minutes over, but I wanted to get through the chapter. An exciting story. And we'll hear what happens after the shipwreck, but they all made it. Pretty amazing. All right, Eddie, come on up. I will go back and get your slides up for you. Oh, Dion's already has some up. Oh, Brad, sorry. Not Eddie. Double duty.
It looks so much larger.
Thank you, sir. Oh, I didn't turn it on. Just turn the switch on the front there.
It's coming. Number 180, Wonderful Story of Love. On this song, we're going to eliminate the chorus on all three verses, so be aware of that. Wonderful story of love, tell to me again. Wonderful story of love, wake the immortal strain. Angels with the rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still it hath called today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, even from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Jesus provides a rest, wonderful story of love, for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing a rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. Number 405. Wonderful words of life. Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of life. Let me more of their beauty see, wonderful words of life. Words of life and beauty, teach me faith and duty. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Christ the Blessed One gives to all wonderful words of life. Sinner listen to the loving call, wonderful words of life. Also freely given, wooing us to heaven. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Sweetly echo the gospel call, wonderful words of life. Offer pardon and peace to all, wonderful words of life. Jesus, only Savior, sanctified forever. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life.